Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm so glad you're joining us because usually when we study a massive cultural revolution or, the toppling of an empire, the historical playbook is pretty standard.
Right. It's armies and brilliant generals.
Exactly. We
Mhm.
picture complex military strategies and massive conquests. Basically, overthrowing power through sheer force.
Yeah, it's the most common pattern in human history.
Yeah.
We're conditioned to look for the sword that cuts down the reigning king.
But the Roman Empire defies that pattern. I mean,
Yes.
when you look at the absolute undisputed heavyweight champion of the ancient world, you realize its most profound transformation didn't come from a bigger army on its
Yeah,
borders.
it didn't.
It was structurally inverted from the inside by a hunted underground movement that flatly refused to pick up a single weapon. I'm talking about the early Christian church. And today, we are exploring a translated transcript from a biblical humanities lecture that unpacks this exact era. So, whether you are a history buff or you're just insanely curious about the underlying mechanics of how human behavior shapes cultural shifts, we're going to completely reframe how you view revolutions.
Yeah, and our mission today is to really analyze this historical paradox.
Yeah.
We are looking closely at the source material to understand how the early church utilized a concept called evangelism by showing.
Evangelism by showing. I love that term.
It's fascinating, right? We'll also examine how a radical redefinition of the term martyr slowly overturned the Roman social hierarchy,
Yeah.
and going all the way from slaves up to the emperor himself.
Which is just a crazy trajectory.
It really is. And before we get into the details, it's important to clarify our approach here. We are analyzing a translated lecture on religious history.
Right, so we're dealing with the source's specific cultural and moral arguments.
Exactly. Our goal is to impartially unpack the mechanics of these arguments. We're here to convey the ideas presented in the text
Yeah.
rather than, endorsing them as objective truth.
Right. We are looking at the sociology and the strategy behind the history. So to understand how this movement eventually took over, we first have to establish why they were hiding in the first place.
Yeah, the context of persecution.
Because the Roman Empire was incredibly vast, right? And polytheistic. They integrated the gods of conquered peoples into their own pantheon all the time.
They did, yeah.
So given that broad tolerance, the intense, unique persecution of this one specific group seems kind of contradictory.
Well, the contradiction resolves when you look at the actual function of religion in the Roman state. You have to
Yes.
remember, Rome was this massive administrative umbrella covering countless distinct cultures, languages, local
This
traditions.
is a logistical nightmare.
Exactly. Maintaining cohesion across that vast territory was an immense challenge. Consequently, emperor worship was instituted not as a deeply spiritual exercise, but as a political tool for unity.
Like a pledge of allegiance.
Precisely. Offering a pinch of incense to the image of the emperor was the Roman equivalent of a civic duty. It was a visible, public pledge.
Okay, so it was basically a compliance test. The state didn't necessarily care which local deities you prayed to in your private life, as long as you, publicly demonstrated your loyalty to the overarching Roman system.
Right.
But the Christians, operating under a strict mandate to worship only their God, they refused to participate in that specific public ritual.
And that refusal changed their classification entirely.
How so?
The Romans didn't view them merely as a fringe religious sect anymore. They viewed them as political dissidents.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By refusing the civic gesture of emperor worship, they were essentially declaring themselves enemies of the state. And that level of insubordination threatened the fragile unity of the empire.
Which puts a literal target on their backs.
Exactly.
So that structural hostility forced the movement to build a shadow infrastructure. They went underground, quite literally carving out spaces in the catacombs.
Yeah, the physical reality of the underground church is wild.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because they were basically running the ultimate high-stakes speakeasy. But instead of hiding booze, they were hiding their core beliefs. And the source points out this fascinating geological luck that made this possible, particularly in areas like Cappadocia.
Right, in modern-day Turkey.
Wow.
The geography there offered a really unique advantage. The soil in that region is highly calcareous. It's very limestone rich.
Yeah, okay.
So when you dig into it, it's actually relatively soft and pliable. It makes excavation really manageable, even with primitive tools.
But wait, if you carve out a massive underground space and soft dirt, common sense says it should just collapse on you.
It absolutely would, except this specific soil undergoes a chemical reaction. The moment the freshly carved limestone is exposed to the air, it oxidizes.
No way.
Yeah, that oxidation process hardens the walls almost like cement.
That is incredible.
Right. Because of this natural hardening, these early believers could engineer massive, multi-level subterranean cities without needing to import, heavy wooden support beams.
So they utilized the local chemistry to build a fortified shadow society. That's brilliant. But looking at the sociology of this group, I have to point out what seems like a fatal flaw in their whole setup.
Okay, what's that?
The sources outline a barrier to entry that just defies common sense. I mean, joining this movement meant you had to relinquish your personal property to the communal group. And on top of that, it essentially guaranteed you a permanent death warrant from the state.
It was a steep cost of admission, yeah.
Right. Human psychology dictates that if an organization's onboarding process is give us all your stuff and prepare to be hunted, their membership numbers should be 0. Why didn't this movement just fizzle out immediately?
From a purely rational self-preservation standpoint, you're entirely correct. It should have failed. A group operating under a constant state of lethal suppression can't rely on standard recruitment.
Because public preaching was a death sentence.
Exactly. They couldn't assemble in town squares or hand out pamphlets. So, to survive and grow, they had to develop completely nonverbal, highly covert communication networks.
Because even basic logistics, like traveling between cities, were super dangerous. I mean, you couldn't just check into a standard Roman inn.
No, definitely not.
The sources note that those public houses were deeply intertwined with local state religion, idolatry, and prostitution. So for a movement that was strictly policing its own moral boundaries, the public infrastructure was a no-go.
Right. They needed a secure way to identify safe harbors among total strangers.
And this necessity birthed what I think is one of the most effective pieces of ancient covert communication. The ichthys, or the fish symbol.
Yeah, the fish symbol is a classic example of this secret network.
The mechanics of how they used it are just brilliant. To me, it functioned a lot like modern asymmetric cryptography, where you have a public key and a private key.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah. Imagine a traveler arriving in an unfamiliar Roman town. They couldn't just ask, hey, where's the local underground church?
Obviously not.
Instead, while they're just engaged in casual conversation with a stranger, they would use a walking stick, or maybe their toe, to idly draw a single curved arc in the dirt.
Just casually doodling.
Exactly. And that single arc is the public key. To anyone outside the movement, it's just a meaningless scratch in the dust.
But if the stranger was a fellow believer, they possessed the private key, so to speak, to decode that message.
Right.
They would casually draw a second intersecting arc, completing the shape of a fish. And without a single incriminating word being spoken, the connection is verified.
It's so elegant.
It really is. And then the traveler would be quietly absorbed into the local underground network, given shelter and supplies.
Just a perfect solution to the identification problem. But of course, inevitably, many were caught. Which brings us to the public spectacle, the Roman arenas.
The Colosseum and places like it, yeah?
We hear about the arenas a lot, but the source emphasizes the psychological function of them. It wasn't merely a venue for violent entertainment. Rome had basically created an extreme, desensitizing version of reality TV.
Yes. It was a highly calibrated instrument of state-sponsored psychological deterrence.
Feeding a populace addicted to violence.
Right. The arena was the ultimate demonstration of the state's monopoly on violence. They used these spectacles to visually enforce their dominance over enemies, criminals, dissidents. But for the deterrence to actually work, the victims had to play a specific role in the script.
They were supposed to act a certain way.
Exactly. They were supposed to panic. They were supposed to beg for mercy or curse their captors or, fight back in a futile display of desperation.
And the crowd fed on that terror.
Because it reinforced their own safety and the absolute supremacy of Rome.
Right. But the Christians fundamentally destabilized that script. This is the core turning point the source refers to as evangelism by showing.
Yeah,
breaking the script. When they were dragged into the center of the arena, they refused to exhibit terror. They didn't scream or curse. They actually viewed martyrdom as the greatest honor.
Which is completely counterintuitive to the Roman mindset.
Completely. They faced horrific deaths calmly, and they actively prayed for and blessed the executioners who were killing them.
And what's fascinating here is the psychological impact on the audience.
Yeah.
We have to consider the cognitive dissonance this created.
Oh, it must have been staggering.
You have tens of thousands of Roman citizens gathered to witness a horror show, expecting to feel superior. Instead, they witnessed individuals facing death with a profound, transcendent peace that the spectators themselves didn't even have in their own daily lives.
It completely short-circuited the intended psychological effect of the arena. The state designed it to be a mechanism of terror, but the victims repurposed it into a platform for their own message.
It broke the Roman script entirely.
The crowd must have been left wondering, like, what could possibly be so anchoring that a person would willingly embrace a violent death rather than simply burn a pinch of incense?
The deterrence failed. It just flat out failed.
It did. And while that public display eroded the psychological dominance of the state in the arenas, the real structural damage to the Roman hierarchy happened quietly.
Yeah, an inside job.
Right inside the private estates and courts of the Roman elite. The social pyramid was being dismantled from the bottom up.
The sources detail this really fascinating shift in labor dynamics, specifically concerning slaves.
This is one of my favorite aha moments from the sources, because in the Roman system, a slave was legally considered property, just a tool that operated almost entirely out of fear of physical punishment.
Right. But Roman masters began noticing a shift in their Christian slaves. These individuals were displaying an unprecedented joy, peacefulness, and an incredible work ethic without needing to be forced or threatened.
Because the underlying motivation had completely changed.
Exactly. They no longer viewed their work merely as forced servitude to a human master, but as a service to their God. And this internal motivation produced a level of integrity that fear could never extract from a person.
So imagine the shock of a wealthy Roman master witnessing this, right? They secretly follow their model slave to an underground catacomb meeting to figure out what's going on.
And what do they find?
They discover that their slave, the person who scrubs their floors, is actually the presiding pastor or bishop of the local church.
Historical records confirms these scenarios actually occurred, and it led to a stunning role reversal.
An incredible sociological earthquake.
Because in the real world above ground, the master owned the slave. They had the power of life and death. But in the catacomb, that hierarchy evaporated. The aristocratic master knelt to receive communion and spiritual guidance from the very person they legally owned.
It rendered the whole class structure spiritually irrelevant, and they didn't even have to initiate an armed rebellion to do it.
No swords required.
And this inversion wasn't just isolated to the slave-master dynamic either. It actively infiltrated the Roman justice system. The legal magistrates were baffled.
Yeah, the judges tasked with interrogating these Christians were the next wave of elite conversions.
Because they were uncovering crimes that made absolutely no sense to them. The concept of debt slavery is the clearest example here.
It's a profound detail from the sources. A judge will be investigating a Christian's background and discover that the individual had literally sold themselves into slavery.
Voluntarily surrendered their freedom.
Yes, just to acquire enough capital to pay off the debts of a fellow believer and get them out of prison.
Which, to a highly educated Roman judge, must have computed as total insanity.
It was incomprehensible. Their entire worldview and legal training were predicated on accumulating power, status, and self-preservation. The Roman legal framework had zero mechanism to process a person willingly embracing subjugation just to benefit someone else.
It created a profound crisis of logic for the magistrates. They were prosecuting a group whose moral framework was vastly superior to the state they were supposed to be defending.
And the result was that many of these judges were so moved by this incomprehensible selflessness that they converted on the spot.
They just abandoned their prestigious careers.
They did. In fact, many of the early church fathers, the great scholars and leaders who later codified the theology, were actually these converted legal minds.
So, the movement has captured the masses in the arena. It's captured the slaves, the aristocrats, and the local magistrates. But how does it jump to the absolute top of the food chain? The emperor himself.
To understand that, we have to look at the systemic crises happening at the very top of the Roman state. By the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, the empire was suffering from profound internal decay.
The decadence of Rome. The source material paints a really grim picture of this absolute moral collapse. It wasn't just military overextension. The social fabric was completely unraveling.
Unraveling is the right word.
You had widespread sexual immorality to the point where paternity was completely untraceable. The sources even mention chastity belts being bypassed with duplicate keys.
Right. In an aristocratic society built on inheritance, untraceable lineage creates a massive socio-political vacuum.
And the culture of consumption became grotesque. The elite would host these massive banquets, eat until they were entirely full, and then literally induce vomiting just so they could continue eating all day.
It's the symptom of a society that has lost its forward momentum. They were consuming purely for the sensation of consumption, totally devoid of any higher purpose.
But the most severe symptom of this decay, at least to me, was the practice regarding unwanted infants.
The discarding of children, yes.
If a Roman family deemed a female infant unwanted, it was entirely legal and socially acceptable to just toss the child in the streets to die. It's a terminal lack of empathy.
It is. But against this backdrop of societal self-destruction, the Christian contrast was striking.
Extremely striking. The sources explain how Christian women became highly sought after by Roman noblemen.
Even the ones who didn't share the faith.
Right, because these women actually valued fidelity. In a society fractured by cheating, a partner who strictly adhered to a moral code of loyalty was an invaluable asset.
And these women subsequently raised their noble-born children within the faith.
While simultaneously, the underground church actively sought out those discarded infants in the streets, rescuing them and effectively creating the first primitive orphanages.
Which brings us to Emperor Constantine's pragmatism.
Yeah, so what does this all mean for Constantine? Because we usually hear about him having this grand religious vision in the sky, but this source points to something incredibly practical.
If we connect all these pieces to the bigger picture, Constantine was, above all, a pragmatist. He was a strategist managing a failing state.
Right.
He looked across a rotting, collapsing empire and realized a fundamental truth. Laws cannot fix moral rot. You can pass infinite laws against corruption, but if the people lack an internal moral compass, the laws are just ink on paper.
So true.
The only people in his entire empire who were broadly immune to the bribery, the sexual corruption, and the gluttony were the Christians.
The very people the state had spent 2 centuries trying to exterminate.
Exactly. So he legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, not just to save their souls, but to save the Roman Empire from eating itself alive. He needed their structural integrity to prop up his failing administration.
Wow. He basically absorbed their incorruptible moral framework.
He did.
Which leads to the final synthesis of the source material. It argues that true martyrdom isn't just about dying for a cause in an arena.
No, it introduces a concept called the martyrdom of life.
The martyrdom of life. What does that mean exactly?
It means living with such unshakable integrity, joy, and radical generosity that the people around you can't help but be transformed. It's the daily sacrifice of ego and self-interest for a higher ethical standard.
And the argument is that this sustained visible integrity is vastly more disruptive than any physical force or sword, which brings this entire deep dive right back to you, the listener.
Absolutely.
We live in a modern world full of noise and intense friction. There is this constant drive to win debates or force cultural alignment or just outshout the opposition. But the lesson here is that evangelism, by showing, simply living out your values visibly and joyfully, is still the most disruptive force on earth.
It really challenges you to evaluate your own environment. If your daily actions and your treatment of people who offer you no tangible benefit were scrutinized, would they present a compelling alternative to the surrounding culture?
That is the big question. They didn't argue the empire into submission. They built an alternative that was too robust to ignore. But I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to ponder on your own.
Okay, what is it?
For 200 years, the church thrived on the margins. They grew in power specifically because they were an underground rebellion. The pressure forged them.
Right.
But once Constantine handed them the keys to the empire, making them the ultimate establishment, did they inadvertently lose the very radical spark that made them so appealing in the dark of the catacombs?
The classic tension between surviving on the margins and governing from the center.
Exactly. Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep examining the structures around you, keep asking the hard questions, and we will catch you next time.